Good morning. The other day, I caught it live, and it was a discussion on black and brown relations amongst the youth in the streets of LA. And I think folks were having this discussion based on what those relationships were in the 90s and maybe 2000s. I don't think it's the same today that it was back then, but they were going to discuss it. During this discussion, a video that Tyga made came up where he depicted Latinos, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Raza, etc., Hispanics in a negative, in negative stereotypes. And one scene in particular had tortilla chips raining down on this negative portrayal of Latinos, and he was eating the chips, overweight, what have you. In bringing that up, the host, who's Latino, said, how would it be if I portrayed a black person in negative stereotypes and had, these food items raining on him, one of which was watermelon. And, there was two black guests on this panel and then this Latino host. And one of the black guests says, that's really racist or offensive, maybe both. Do you even know the history of watermelon? And I thought, he doesn't know the history. The Latino host doesn't know the history. And I don't know if he asked, do you know the history of tortilla chips too? Because he was going to make the argument that it's not a comparable analogy. It's you're taking something that doesn't have a long history of racism attached to it and giving it the same value as something that does. That is where I think the black guy was going had he been able to make his point. He was cut off every time he tried to make a point. He was not allowed to speak. And so I didn't get to hear the history. And when he asked, I can admit I didn't know the history. Like, why is watermelon a racist trope? I knew it was a racist trope, but I guess, for whatever flaws I have, I never bothered to go see why it was. And I was curious because it didn't make sense. Like, I didn't get it. So I looked it up, and this is what I learned. That before the Civil War, some slaves would work out informal arrangements with their owners where they were allowed a small patch of land as a personal garden. And they would grow food they could eat, and watermelons were easy to grow there. Furthermore, watermelons originated, they were first cultivated in Africa. And so they might have had a connection to them already, but here they were easy to grow, and so they would grow them and sell them. Watermelon is, you get a good one. It's an amazing thing to eat. And so after the Civil War, the slaves that were free, they still had contracts with their former slave owners because they still needed work and they still needed the labor, right? And they still had their little personal gardens. But now they could freely sell watermelons, and it became a lucrative business for formerly freed slaves. For the first time ever, they were now businessmen. They were merchants. They were given this power over their own destiny. When they were done with their obligations under the contracts they had, they could go tend to their garden and grow more watermelons and sell more and be more self-reliant. The former slave owners, a lot of them didn't like how that looked. They saw that despite these deplorable conditions that former slaves were living in, a lot of them were rising up because of selling watermelons. And so they started to paint them they started tying the watermelon to black folks and negative human traits like childishness, uncleanliness. I guess because when you eat a watermelon, I'm happy eating one, and sometimes you get messy. I don't know. It still doesn't make sense to me, but that's what happened. And there was movies. There's I think a movie, The Birth of a Nation, where they show white folks enticing black folks to not work with the offers of watermelon. And so some people who never been around black folks, this might be the only impressions they're seeing, and thus it was used, this smear campaign was used to attack something that was a symbol of self-reliance and empowerment to black people. Because again, they could be merchants, they could be businessmen, that they could come up. And people use the word haterism a lot, but like that's actually the definition of haterism. You see someone coming up and you mad that they're getting theirs, and they're not even doing nothing to you. They're just selling watermelons. And it's also the definition of like hate groups. They were mad that this was empowering a group of people that they despised, and they wanted to take that empowerment away from them. And I wouldn't be surprised if some black folks today don't feel self-conscious eating watermelon because of all that bullshit from back then that, is wholly unjustified. I love watermelon. So I never understood the trope. I'm glad that, the black panelists mentioned, do you even know the history? Because it piqued my interest and made me go look it up and come up with a video to share it. Again, I wish you would be hearing this from him instead of me. Now, the host, again, I believe was not capacitated for a deeper conversation because his behavior, that's what it showed me. I think a deeper conversation could have been had, because the purpose of the whole discussion was to build bridges between communities. Where I could find commonality in that history of the watermelon, first is, hey, a while back, this basketball team of mostly Mexican-American kids beat a team of mostly white, well-to-do kids. And in response, the white kids pelted them with tortillas. And I shouldn't say pelted, because the tortilla is not going to hurt if it hits you. Shit, warm them up and throw me some butter too. I'll eat those motherfuckers. But anyways, how does that tie into the tortilla chips falling? Or is this the birth of something similar to what happened with the watermelons? I mean, I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but the history of the watermelon could have opened the conversation that way. So how are things... Do you see any analogies with us and our food, being used against us? There's a slur for Latinos, around beans. And the truth is, I love beans. I'm like the Bubba of Forrest Gump, but with beans. You know, I like refried beans, de la olla, beans charros, and frijoladas. Like, it's a discussion that could have been had, but again, the brother was not allowed to speak because the host didn't seem capable of a deeper discussion. Another place where, you know, and that would have been looking for commonality. Another thing is that today, in 2024, I could drive around my neighborhood, which meets a lot of legislative definitions like marginalized community or disadvantaged community. You know, these are legislative definitions that means money goes to my neighborhood because we're poor and mostly non-white. And I could drive around here and I'll still see, you know, older black men, you know, older Mexican men, sometimes some young Mexican dudes, some young ones, with a old pickup truck bed full of watermelons. And they're selling watermelons. And other times I'll drive by a house and I'll see, you know, the family out there. And I've seen all ethnicities. And they're selling cherries. Or they're selling oranges they grew. So it's still a thing. You know, that history and that discussion on the Tiger video could have led to something like, hey, that's a trip how, you know, our people can still find a way to supplement their income with their garden. And some do it, some don't. But it was an area of commonality that could have been discussed and found and helped to build bridges. But it didn't happen like that. And the purpose of this video, I could bash the host, the Brown side of the conversation all day for his performance. That's not the point. The point is, I thought that the story of the watermelon was important to know, why it's a racist trope. And now we know it doesn't really have anything to do with black attributes other than positive ones, which they were able to make a living off of growing watermelons when all the odds were stacked against them. You know, this is right after the Civil War. And that this is something that both our communities still do today, grow stuff to sell. And that, food and things that are cultural identifiers in some ways. And I think everyone eats beans, but I do love some beans, but I think everybody eats them. But anyways, that sometimes things are used unfairly, and how can we combat that, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a great opportunity for a good conversation was lost. But I'm glad that I watched that, because I think I'm kind of happy with this video. I'm like, damn, I never knew, and now I know, and I can share it with you. So have a good one. Much love. Enjoy your weekend. Be safe.